What's up?
Hard dicks and helicopters, my guy.
How's it going?
Oh man. Well, Mark and I both have COVID right now. So Mark got hit a lot harder than I did. So Mark's gonna dip out while we talk. So get some rest. See if we're gonna do a reaction after this.
Yeah, that works fine. I do home health care, and actually one of the people I work with got COVID, so I had to do the whole quarantine and test every day. I didn't have it though. I tested negative, but
well, I mean, there's so many I don't know how those PCR like at home tests are so fucking inaccurate. Like false positives and false negatives out the wazoo. And then of course it's like, you know, this virus is constantly fucking changing, right? I mean,
yeah.
You had what? You had Alpha variant, you had Delta variant, you had you had Omicron. Right, but then there was like 17 variants before Omicron actually came forward. And now then we had Omicron B4, which is what Trump got, I think. Then we had Omicron B5, which is what Biden got. And now there's Omicron BQ 1.1, which is probably what we have. I don't fucking know.
Even if you look at so I was debating someone the other day, and we were looking at a CDC paper, or no, it was a New England Journal of Medicine paper, and it was breaking down, comparing protection from Pfizer vaccine to Moderna vaccine to natural immunity to a combination of them. And when you looked, it was only focusing on Omicron, and then it gave the designation for Omicron that was BAFG 7.1, BAFG 7.2, and it's holy shit, as a layman, it's hard enough to look at this stuff, but once you start breaking it down like that, suffice it to say natural immunity was superior in all metrics, as we've known for quite some time. But it's interesting to see how they go.
One of the things that I've taken issue with is some of the people talking about this, natural immunity being better than vaccinated, right? Which is true. We've always known that. We knew at the very beginning of the pandemic that there was some level of conferred immunity for people with MERS. We knew people that had Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome had some level of immunity. And so I wanted to talk with you about this because there's a couple of things that it's kind of been brought back up because of this, people's CDC, which we were just talking about, right? And how we all need to be panicking. We need to mask forever. And, some of the people are finally kind of recanting some of the bullshit that they had and the COVID amnesty and things. I kind of wanted to do a little bit of a recap and talk with you about it because it's this is the gift that keeps on giving for content that isn't, doing a panel with minor attractive persons. That's actually
you avoided that. You avoided that evil scumbag shit. Good for you. Like any normal human being, it's unreal. BPF from the Crucible, one of the things I've talked to him a lot about is I understand people selling out, but what constantly shocks me is how little people are willing to sell out for. Oh boy, 5 more viewers. I'll stream with a bunch of pedos talking about, well, maybe we do need to listen. No. If I was on that panel, it would have lasted 3 minutes for me. I would have been like, I hope I never see you in real life, and you all should be in prison for the rest of your lives. End of panel. I'm out. Good luck, but neither here nor there.
Yeah, I had to throw a little dig out because I was like, Jesus fuck. Yeah. I was like, Jesus Christ. Are you streaming right now?
The cutthroat world of, the big numbers on Twitch streaming, got to get those 3-4 more viewers and sell out a little more. It's ridiculous.
It's what's funny to me is why talk to maps when you can just buy views? I know half of these fuckers do anyways.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Yeah, the 5 more viewers to do that crazy drama shit. Just talk about some real shit. You know why they don't? Because they don't have anything to say about real shit. They don't know what the fuck they're talking about.
This is getting a little meta, but that's why so many people are attracted to the panels, because you can hide, right? You get a bigger audience. Because let's say I do a panel with a bigger left-wing streamer. Let's say Vosh is doing a panel and me and you are on it, which he won't, because Vosh will run from people like me and you.
Vosh is a pussy.
The only way he would ever debate us is on a panel or something, because he could hide. You could just meme your way through it. But what you do then, if you're everyone else, you're like, oh, all of his viewers are watching me. And then you just have a couple of talking points that you had going in, and you don't interact with what the other people were saying, and you just be basically irrelevant. And that's how you pad your viewers.
I remember one thing I noticed, and the first time I noticed it was when I want to say it was a Hippy Dippy, right? And I did a panel, and we were talking about like the Voting Rights Act, right? And I was clearly the only one that actually did any reading of the bill.
Mm-hmm.
And then so what I brought up was like, hey, you talking about voting rights, why is it that in this bill it moves all court cases based off of voting rights to the DC appellate court and circumnavigates the entire Constitution and judicial review that is supposed to occur where appellate courts happen in your district, where you're in a district, right? And then where certain Supreme Court judges have districts selected to them to determine whether or not they want to bring it forward, and then they discuss amongst themselves. Why are we circumnavigating the entire Constitution and judicial review? This is clearly a sham to have gerrymandering specifically be utilized by like a very left-wing thing. And I brought that point up, and I brought it up like 4 times on the panel, and every single person on Hippy Dippy completely acted like I never said that. And it was like, I was like, oh, you can just attack somebody else and just ignore any strong point on a panel that makes you look like an idiot.
That's exactly right. And if you see, like, I'm a right winger, I guess, like, so they will, you try, if you're, I don't blame Dylan or the people setting up the panels. What you're trying to do is set up 4 righties, 4 lefties, have some sort of mix, some sort of disagreement on issues. I get that. But what ends up happening is this. It'll be 2 righties that are basically lefties by another name, and then me, and then someone who's like ridiculously a caricature of right wingers. So like, I remember, and the person's probably watching right now. I like this person, but it was a bad take from them. We were talking about immigration, illegal immigration. And so I had this take that was like, look, before we talk about what to do with Dreamers, we need border security, but it is unfeasible to kick 30 million people out. But the first things, so I have more of a nuanced take, not that nuanced, but more of one. And this dude's like, we just need to set up turrets at the border and shoot every motherfucker that comes within, and then do you think anyone's responding to me? They're just like, here we go, crazy bloodthirsty right winger. And that's the way these panels work. If you are on there and you have something to say that sort of actually pertains to the topic, that in a way that's interesting to talk about, they're not interested. They attack the weak point, and you can't even blame people. That's the nature of the panel. I myself I've been people that have made good points on an issue, but I don't have time to respond to it because I'm responding to some insane shit that someone said, and they're like, you're a racist, and then you're like, no, here's 10 reasons you're wrong. So I get it. The whole panel system sucks, but the reason people do it, so many people, I'm not going to say names or anything here, but there are so many people that can't make it on their own. They can't do content by themselves, and they can't carry a one-on-one debate, right? So what you do is you enter the panel circuit, and I will always think it's funny, regardless of what you think of Destiny. It is so funny to watch the left cut off their nose to spite their face. By kicking Destiny off, all the numbers on those panel shows dropped because he was the one person that was willing to go on those panels and bring big numbers of viewers. So, okay, congratulations, Keffels and the trans mafia on Twitch. You got him kicked off. Now enjoy your no viewers,
Yeah, I mean, well, the thing is that like Twitch politics it's an interesting thing. I was talking about this earlier, but I really do want to talk about COVID, so I'm going to swing back to that after this. But Twitch politics in general is like there's a community, and the community is leftist, right? And you know this because I was on Twitter the other day, and I was like, oh wow, Wick's doing really well. And then I see him on Twitter, and it's like, thank you so much, Chud Logic. Thank you so much, Not So Erudite. Thank you so much, this person. Thank you so much, this person. Thank you so much, this person, for all the raids, right? And I was just like, and the thing is that they all share the same audience. Yeah. And so and they cannibalize each other's audiences by engaging in whatever drama or whatever thing they can do to get that audience over to them for that day. Whereas people like you and me, Twitch politics isn't our audience. We primarily pull from offsite. I pull people from YouTube, from Twitter, people that have found me that were homeless here, right? And so it's everything that I have in our community is mostly just our community, right? There's some sharing. I have people that watch you, and vice versa, I'm sure. But for the most part, it's probably 70% of my audience are people that just watch me, whereas it's probably 20% for a lot of these other people. And so it's when you got rid of Destiny, you fucked yourselves really bad. You and I were probably mostly isolated because most of our viewers were not Destiny viewers.
Right. Yeah, there might have been 2 or 3 people that watch me regularly that regularly watch Destiny. So it's not going to affect me numbers wise. Look, there's always exceptions to the rule, right? So I'm not saying this about everyone, but I genuinely want people to grow that have ideas similar to me, or that have ideas that even if I disagree with, I think are interesting. I genuinely feel that way. I don't feel it's a zero-sum game. I would not give a shit if 6 months from now you're pulling in 10,000 viewers. I'm not going to be embittered on my show like, those could have been. It would be good for me, but even if it wasn't, I wouldn't give a shit. And what you see is so many of these people and it happens. I'm not saying there are people on the right like this.
Interrupt you real quick. If in 6 months you were getting 10K viewers and I was getting the same viewers, I would legitimately be mad. I can act like I'm not going to be mad, and I can be like, no, it's great for Rob Noerr. But if I was sitting chilling in like the 30s and 40s, and you were in 10K, I'd be like, what the fuck do these people see in him that they do not see in me? What the fuck am I doing? Like, this is some bullshit. Like, don't even lie. You'd be a little bit like, this motherfucker.
No, I wouldn't. I honestly wouldn't. With this one caveat, if you didn't ghost
me, you'd be like, this is some bullshit, man. Like, when I get some of this love.
But listen, if you didn't ghost me, I would be okay with it, right? There are people that are bigger right wingers, right? I don't know. Like, I'll give you an example. Like Lauren Southern. Asked me to do these Odyssey game things. I agreed and then forgot it was a day that I was supposed to be at a party, so I was blackout drunk doing these stupid games, eating bugs and shit like that. And then part of it was like, oh yeah, and then Lauren's gonna we're gonna do a show together, just a conversation or whatever. And that was over a year ago. And I've reached out to her producer, which I know several times. It's like, by the way, it's still interested in doing a show with Lauren. Oh, well, she's really busy. She doesn't have time. Which is true 90% of the time. But it's like, really, couldn't find one day in a year? Couldn't find one day? No, and it's like,
not Lauren. Lauren has abandoned you. Oh man, that's funny.
Which I don't give a shit about. But it's just that there's a there's some sort of etiquette.
I think she still thinks I'm a commie. Which is hilarious.
I don't mind her. And I'm not embittered or anything. I'm just saying that there is part of that's I am actively trying to think, and this, we've had conversations off the air. I'm actively trying to be I would like a community to grow. I think Twitch is a space that we could start to make inroads culturally against these insane lefties. So I'd like to see people grow that aren't in that group. Even if you're a moderate lefty, I would like to see that grow. And I think that what you see is a lot of this cannibalization, particularly on the left, because think about it. There's so much competition if you're streaming politics on the left on a space like Twitch that the average person just isn't getting shit for viewers. So you're like a vampire. As soon as you see someone have some drama, you latch onto it because you're like, now's my chance. And there were people, I remember watching left-wing streamers I know tweeting out oh boy, if you're in Destiny's audience now that he's gone, come watch me. And it's like, damn, you guys are bloodthirsty. If you got kicked off, I can't imagine being like, oh well, hey, Fabian's audience, why don't you come to me? I'd be like, this fucking sucks. What are we doing kicking this guy off? This is ridiculous. But not them. With friends like that, right? So I hope that I never become that. Yeah.
So circling back to COVID, right? Because both of us are prone to tangents. One of the things that never gets talked about enough is, and one of the things I kind of wanted to talk with you about is, this data has been available from the very beginning, and all it is, right? If you just type in CDC COVID deaths by age in Google, right? Mm-hmm. You bring up the provisional deaths by COVID-19 death, sex, and age, right? Nope, that's not the one I'm looking for. Where it is, weekly updates. Here we go. Right, and so I'm gonna stream it to you because I just want to.
Good.
We want to look at comorbidities and conditions, right? And so let me stream this real quick. To you. Just a second. All right, you got that?
Yep.
Let me fix my camera so it's not all wild.
Oh, there's our DMs. Oh shit.
So, this is something that I talk about often, and I don't see enough people talking about. And it infuriates me that I don't see enough people talking about it. Because it's probably the most important thing to talk about. And it's always been the biggest red flag to me. So we keep getting all this information. Children we got to get our kids vaxxed, right? We got to push the jab in schools. I mean, if you saw did you see the America First legal thing that I sent you? The leaks?
It was behind a paywall, but I did read some of it before it wanted me to join. I was on my phone all day, so I couldn't check it
okay,
all
on your
out.
phone.
It's not like
Yeah,
the first
yeah.
4 paragraphs.
Yeah, so I mean, like what they show from the leaks is that the CDC talking about like how to vaccinate people when the parents aren't around, how to convince people. It was a lot of equity, a lot of bullshit. But one of the things I want to look at, right, is so see this category right here. This is 0 to 24, right?
It says stream paused for me. It says you have minimized your application.
Oh my god! All right, hold on. Let me do it like this. Does it work now?
No.
Let me make sure I'm streaming the right window to you. I might have been streaming the wrong window. Does that work?
There we go. Now I can see it. Yep.
Okay. So this is 0 to 24 years of age, right? This is the entire pandemic. This is since COVID hit. These are the deaths from people under 24. 3,892, right? So less than 4,000. Yep. As a point of reference, each year, 2,500 people die from Tylenol overdose.
Yep.
Okay, so you're more likely to know someone that OD'd on Tylenol than you are to know someone 24 years or younger that's died of COVID. Now, here's the really important thing. What this is these are groupings by ICD-10 codes. You said you work in healthcare, you know ICD.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. Yes.
Right, so these are groupings by ICD-10 codes. You can go in deeper and look at the actual ICD-10. It's not that important. And what this is these are death certificate ICD-10 codes. So this is everything that is on the death certificate when someone dies. And so what we can see is out of that less than 4,000, almost 1,500, also, God damn it, why is this like randomly scrolling? Sorry. We can see 1,466 had influenza and pneumonia. COVID could cause that, right? Could cause pneumonia. So that's fair. Chronic lower respiratory diseases. This is somebody with COPD, right? The flu would have killed them, right? Adult respiratory distress syndrome, COVID could cause that. Respiratory failure, COVID could cause that. Respiratory distress, etc. Now, diabetes. 10% of those people have diabetes.
Yep.
Okay? Hypertension. You're fucking 24 or younger and you have hypertension, right? 3% of people have that.
Yep.
Ischemic heart disease. 1% of people have that. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. 20% of these people are so obese, it's on their death certificate.
Yep.
Okay? And the cherry on top, 10% of people have an ICD-10 code that is grouped as intentional and unintentional injury, poisoning, and other adverse effects. So 10% of these deaths are people in car accidents, or people who were poisoned, or people who fell off of their ladder cleaning their fucking gutters and like broke both their legs and almost bled out. It is very obvious once you start breaking down the ICD-10 codes that you're talking about probably 2,000 people that died because of COVID and another 2,000 people that died that would have died from something else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's looking at this age. I mean, you could go. I've parsed through all this just like you're doing here. I mean, think about. So let's talk about some of the things that this will show. I still believe this is the case. It's very close, but the average age of death of COVID in the United States is greater than the average life expectancy. So life expectancy in the United States is something like 77 years. The average age of death of COVID, I think, is like 77.8 years or something like that. That means that if you, all things averaged out, people that are dying of COVID on average are doing so at, and you could look at, even without getting into average, you could look very easily where it's like more people over the age of 75 have died of COVID than under. Now, what does that mean? Think about it this way, right? Let's look at an issue like I was debating recently, the vaccine mandates, Biden's vaccine mandate. That mandate had to do with OSHA punishing employers, which is asinine on face value, that OSHA would, an executive agency, but even take that aside, screw the mechanism of it. We were punishing people, and these were working age people. So that group there that you were looking at, you're basically talking on average, basically people under the age of 60, and far more than that, that proportion is going to be way more people under the age of 50, right? That's what we're talking about. This disease has not been that big of a deal to those people. It's a big deal if you know someone personally that died. Don't get me wrong. Any death is tragic. If your great-grandmother died of COVID, that fucking sucks. I'm not belittling that.
I think
there are people.
Stalin said it.
Okay.
Stalin said it best, right? The death of one is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic.
Right. That's exactly right. And so why are we, for a disease that we know what the primary comorbidities are, right? Age is one, right? The second is obesity, right? Then things like diabetes, COPD, and other things. All of these things. Why are we punishing healthy people? Right. And then when you start to mince it even further, it's like, well, the data ever since the Israeli study, which was, when did it? I can't even remember when it came out, but it was early in the vaccine.
I think it was early 20, like it was mid 2021 was like the big
right,
one.
like
very early in the rollout. Yeah.
Right. And that study looked at millions of people in Israel and was definitive that natural immunity protected you from getting the illness better, protected you from having a serious case of the illness, and lasted longer than the vaccinated immunity. This was clear cut. Yet months after that, these people were
fair. The data has always shown, right? Has always shown that vaccination status plus natural immunity is better than natural immunity alone, and has always shown that vaccination status without natural immunity was better than just natural. What was better, right? So I mean, like, the vaccine does reduce symptomology, and the vaccine does reduce the likelihood of getting sick. But I want to parse that out a little bit more in a second. But like, just to be fair, right? Like when you're comparing natural immunity to vaccination status, you're not really comparing like terms.
Well, right, but. One, that's not totally true, right? So, like, if you look at the CD, I did a big write-up on this. I could share if you want. This was in January, or early February, mid-February in 2022. I did a write-up on this, and I tried to use only sources that were pro-vaccine. Because here's a spoiler alert, what I think about vaccines. I think that the vaccine, like any medication, is a cost-benefit analysis. Like, for example, chemotherapy makes sense for some people. Right, it's risk assessment. And so if you're a 23-year-old NBA player who's probably amongst one of the fittest people in the world, your risk of having a severe case of COVID is so low that the risk of the side effects of the vaccine probably outweigh it. Right. So to force the government,
a 24-year-old male, right? Like we have we have plenty of data to suggest that your risk of myocarditis and pericarditis is enhanced. But I think what's even more important, right? And we're not able to have these conversations. And so we're getting into new dangerous territory. And the reason is that we can look at elevated levels of, certain chemicals in the bloodstream to determine if heart damage occurs. Right. And so what this is known as is subclinical myocarditis, right? When you have heart damage, but it's not showing up on an EKG. And what we've found is that a majority of people have subclinical myocarditis from the post-vaccine in the first few days. Okay. So there's some level of heart damage. And if you know anything about the heart, it's smooth muscle, right? You know that the heart doesn't heal. That's not how the heart works, right? But it's, one dose of subclinical myocarditis from the vaccination is probably the same damage to your heart as like a good weekend on cocaine, right? Like it's not going to fucking kill you. The problem is that when we do these studies and we say, well, the vaccine's safe and effective, the vaccine's safe and effective, the vaccine's safe and effective, we don't know what reiterations of boosters means. Like, is it always subclinical myocarditis? Does it reach a certain point where, the sixth booster is the one that does you in, right? Or is it just the same risk each time? We don't have that data. We there's a ton of data missing, and the people that are willing to do that data can't get government grants, right? They have to get private grants. They have to use models, right, that are cheaper to use. And then when they use digital models that are cheaper, then the people that get all this big government grants, right, from the CDC and from like universities and shit, where they're getting like this massive amount of income, will be like, oh, well, you're just using a digital model. Like, that's not an appropriate way to do this. Like, this doesn't actually prove anything. And it's like, well, the same models you use in your other research 3 years ago, all of a sudden are a fucking problem because I don't have millions of dollars to spend on this. And so
That's what they do.
There's a lot of
They
problems.
trust the science. Yeah, they trust the science until the data goes the opposite way, and then they say, "Well, there are problems with these models." But the impetus should always be on the people wanting to coerce other people to prove their point, right? That's the starting point. Now, we're both going to be against that coercion, anyways. But if there is a case to be had, it's like, okay, you have to prove when you're talking about.
Mine is just no, always no. I don't care how much fucking
Right.
data you have.
But
Yours is like a
even
certain point, we'll do it. Like
it would have to be ridiculous, right? But even still, the impetus is on them, right? And the problem is like I did this panel once. There were 4 righties, 4 lefties, and at the end of the panel, I said, I think the difference here is this. I said, how many people here think that you have rights? And for the government to restrict those rights, they need to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's necessary to do it. And all the right-wingers raised their hands. And I said, how many people think that the government has the right to restrict your rights for whatever reason, and it's up to you to prove that they shouldn't? And all the left-wingers raised their hands. In a nutshell, that's what's going on. They believe, look, the starting point is you have to prove that you should. And remember, the entire vaccine mandate and all this stuff, they want amnesty now because what they admitted to you at the time was it was always about making your life a living hell. It was about scapegoating you. It was about doing things. You can't go grocery shopping. You can't go visit your parents in the nursing home. You can't have a wedding for your daughter. It was about punishing you. And the data never backed it up. So the impetus was always on them to prove it. And so when they would cite studies that now the very studies, organizations they were citing like the CDC, when the data goes the opposite way, all of a sudden they're like, well, there are problems with the data. Well, then that's on you. Then you should have never embraced the coercion.
So from the very beginning, right? One of the things that people don't understand, right? Because I try and educate, is more than I do try and debate. I just end up debating more because that's how the space works, right?
Right.
But one of the things that people need to understand is that the way the FDA is set up, and as far as I'm concerned, this is where we probably go our separate ways, right? As far as I'm concerned, the FDA is a genocidal organization and should never exist and should be fully privatized. I should be able to buy whatever fucking medication I want, and private companies ought to rate it, and doctors ought to figure out which ones they trust.
Not that far away.
Prescribing medication, right? The FDA is like, I'm loving that the right is like waking up to how big of a problem the FBI is. Yeah. And I'm just sitting here like, when are you going to realize that it's all of the 3-letter agencies? You know what I mean? Like they're all fucking corrupt. But I know I'm not saying you specifically, but the thing is that the way the FDA is set up is completely corrupt. The pharmaceutical companies tell the FDA what their definition of a medication and its efficacy is, right? The FDA just approves the label and determines whether or not it's, whether or not it meets certain health guidelines, and it takes their own clinical trials, right? The FDA sometimes will investigate clinical trials or laboratories, right? But they do not have the manpower in any way, shape, or form to investigate all of them or even a quarter of them, right? It's also important to recognize that 25% of all FDA-approved medications in the United States are eventually recalled, right?
Yep.
So they have a 3-in-1 fucking win rate, right? Which is fine until it's your dead grandma, right? Okay, like 75%'s a fucking C last I checked, and it's not good enough for me. I demand A's for my kids, right? So what ends up happening is with these vaccines is that Pfizer, people will go, oh, well, they changed the definition of a vaccine. No, that's a feature, not a bug. Okay. Right. Pfizer simply said, we're going to call it a vaccine. Okay. The other thing that they changed, which was really important, this was data that they wanted to hide from you guys for 75 years, that people fought, right? Some people fought, some people resigned from the FDA, and good on those people, right? To get released, was that they changed the meaning of how they defined efficacy. So remember when they said vaccines are 100%, that was always a lie. But when they said it was 97 or 96% efficacious, they weren't lying, okay? The problem is that originally, the way vaccines defined efficacy was 97% efficacious meant that there was a 97% chance if you got this vaccine, you would not get the disease. And there was a 3% chance that you would, right? And the way they redefined it was after one contact with the disease. So it had a 97% chance of preventing you from getting COVID if you came into contact with COVID once. And what they didn't tell you is that it was 82% for people that were unvaccinated and for people who had never caught COVID. Right? And so the problem is that when you reiterate that over and over again, everybody catches COVID. It's just the people that are unvaccinated catch it sooner, right? And they have more symptomology. And then they change efficacy to talk about symptomology. And so I think it's important to recognize that this was never a vaccine. It was never intended to be a vaccine. It was simply that Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, they wanted to call it a vaccine. So they called it a vaccine. And the initial thing that scared me, which luckily we don't, it doesn't look like we have, though we might have it, right? Because nobody's really doing the research on this. And it may be what is causing excess deaths. I don't know, so I'm not going to make any claims, especially not on Twitch. Is antibody-dependent enhancement. We may be living in antibody-dependent enhancement. I don't know, but it's always a potential risk whenever you have a vaccine that's not sterilizing. So for the audience that doesn't know what ADE is, right? 1,000-foot bird's eye view, because I'm not a doctor and because, this is really complicated shit. But basically, because you're vaccinated to a specific spike protein chain, right? And you get vaccinated, and then the virus mutates, not necessarily that virus mutates, but like somewhere a virus mutates, sure, and it's more infectious, and so it beats out in competition the original strain or the strain that it mutated from, right? What ends up happening is that your body doesn't recognize the virus, right? And when you have natural immunity, there's like 7 different structures of the virus that you have antibodies produced for. There's the N layer, right? The N protein, there's the biolipid layer. There's several different structures. You're just getting spike proteins with the vaccine. And so what can end up happening is that if you're vaccinated and a new variant comes out, it recognizes it as not a problem. And so it actually facilitates the virus infecting you into the ACE2 receptors. And so we have no explanation for these massive excess deaths. And so they could be the vaccine, right? It could be other factors that we need to research, like, that we just don't understand, like depression, poverty, inflation, ODs, other things like that. It also could be ADE. It could be that people that are vaccinated are dying from COVID because they're vaccinated. It's hard to tell.
There's other... I've read about this. There's other things, like if you look into the story of Merrick's disease, it was a disease that was occurring through poultry, and they had what was called a leaky vaccine, which was the idea that what happened was Merrick disease. I don't have the exact numbers, but it was something like this. It was such percentage infectious, but when it infected chickens, it had like a 10% fatality rate. The vaccine was almost completely effective at stopping the original strain of Merrick's disease. So none of the chickens that were vaccinated were getting this disease. But now the chickens that weren't vaccinated were dying at like a 90% clip. And ultimately what happened was that vaccine mutated to make the vaccine have to keep up over and over. And the running theory is it mutated because of the vaccine, right? But here's my thing.
I don't even... The danger to a non-sterilizing vaccine is that every new strain increases the risk of antibody-dependent enhancement. And so if you're taking a vaccine that's not sterilizing, right? Like there's always a future possibility that a new strain will outright decimate, or I should say devastate, because decimate is 10% death rate, right?
Right.
We'll say devastate, right? Which is the 90%, will devastate a population that's vaccinated, while not harming people that have natural immunity.
Right. And so I don't even get into this, right? It is so complicated for the average person that's like working 9 to 5 to like sit down. So for me, it's just like this, like, look what they did to your life. Look what they did. They told you that you couldn't have a funeral for your mom while they had a lavish funeral for George Floyd, that, by the way, the Nation of Islam did security for. Yeah, right. And John Lewis, right. Like all these people, they were, how many, I don't even have to go through it with you, the times of these leaders that told you that you couldn't do things, that they were then caught doing it themselves, whether it be getting their hair done, going on vacation, whatever, right? Look at what they did to you. And it was all based on something that we now know was a lie. Not only do we now know it's a lie, we know through the Twitter files that the government was pressuring and coercing social media places to censor people that were pointing out that there was data showing it was a lie. So one thing that I wanted to say, that the CDC paper, and I could bring it up if you. Oh, Trump certainly. Look, Trump came out, and I've argued.
2018, he signed into law the creation of CISA.
He backed. Not only that, like, let's make it simpler than that. Trump backed Fauci the whole way. Trump came out initially and said when Brian Kemp didn't want to do lockdowns and Sweden wasn't doing lockdowns that they were wrong. Trump came out initially and said the governors that were doing it best were Cuomo and Newsom. So he set the stage. That's what he did. He signed his chance to win the election away by saying 15 days to slow the spread, we have to do this. They ran with it as the tyrants predictably always do. You give an inch, you get their foot in the door, they radically change how we vote, they do these lockdowns, they collapse the economy. It was all predictable for anyone who's remotely paying attention, which I was. And I will say this real quick before I get on to COVID specific. Pay attention to the people that you listen to, the pundits, the politicians, whatever. It's easy to now come out and say this shit, but who was saying it when it wasn't popular? I was saying it. I was offered a job by Trump's campaign, low-level job, like $30,000, to do my county, to be like the head person in my county for Trump's campaign. I turned it down because they said I would have to get rid of my social media. I was like, it's not worth it to me. A week later, I was on here blasting Trump for the shit he was doing. This is in March of 2020. I had people that were following me for years saying, we knew you were a secret Democrat. You sold out. We're constitutional conservatives, and how dare you? I'm like, really? Can you point to me in the Constitution where it says, oh, by the way, none of this shit matters. If a virus comes along, then we could just discard this whole fucking document? But it was amazing to see how many people, my politicians, they wouldn't speak up, my elected representatives. Now everybody is. Oh, it's easy to be Johnny come late. I'll give you a specific example. Ian Miles Chung. He's this big Twitter guy. He's on with Elon Musk all the time and shit. He put a video. Yeah, he put. Well, or you're talking about Andy. No, Ian Miles Chung's
Ian Miles Chung's are the same thing.
He probably does, but he put a video out that was. I'll take my hat off. I'll try to emulate what he did. When people like me were like, this is going to collapse the economy, he put a 10-second video out that was this. The economy, the economy, the economy, the economy. Making fun of people that were predictably saying, we're going to be suffering economic ramifications for this for years to come. And it's going to, it'll kill people. It'll lower quality of life. It'll lower people's physical, emotional, and mental health. All of it was true. Now he's on there, like that never happened. And I called him out on it on Twitter, and he actually responded. He's like, well, I just meant 15 days. No, fuck you. What you did was mocked people that were right. And so now it's frustrating to me to see how many of these voices didn't say shit when it mattered. When it mattered, when the lockdowns were happening, when the vaccine mandates were being pushed, when people were being basically made their lives living hell, both through legal systems and through culture, because they didn't want to adhere to injecting something into their body that they weren't confident with. Where were these people? They were silent. And now we're supposed to accept that they're these big voices.
To call out my own people, right? I don't have very many friends within the LP, as you can imagine. But to call out my own people, right? The LP in the I can't say the term, but the Prags, we'll just leave it at that, were, had nothing to say about lockdowns. And the only time they had anything to say about lockdowns was when Texas was instituting laws that nullified the federal laws, saying that you weren't allowed to do vaccine mandates. And they were like, this is authoritarian, not allowing businesses to do what they want to do. And it was like, it's to nullify what, I agree. Like, I think businesses all along should have been able to kick people out if they weren't vaccinated. Of
course.
Fire people if you're not vaccinated.
I agree.
I think businesses should have been allowed to have mask mandates or plexiglass or every other thing. The funny thing is that, like, the market showed that people were far more reasonable, and free market capitalism was far more likely to solve this problem than the government ever was. And the best case study of that was that gym in New Jersey, right? When everyone else wanted to lock down, the gym said, no, you got to be healthy. Obesity is killing people. Diabetes is killing people. Not getting exercise is killing people. So we put in HEPA filters. We put in temperature checks. We put in mask mandates, until you get to your gym machine, right? So that you can breathe healthily. And then people were like, no, we got to shut this down. You got to stay locked in your house and eat fucking DoorDash and get fucking fat on a virus that spreads more readily indoors than it does outdoors because it was created in a fucking lab.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'll show you something here real quick. Let's see if I can bring this up. Hopefully. Now, this is from the CDC's paper in January. And I want you to look at this. It looked at two populations, and that was in New York and in California, and it looked at millions of people. And you can see that what it's doing here is it's separating people in four categories. Those that were vaccinated, and in those, the two categories there are previous infection of COVID or no previous, and then those that were unvaccinated, previous infection or non, right? And if you look at these numbers, I won't go through them all in totality, but I did a big write-up on this and some other papers that were gone, and so I'll just go from my writing here. Vaccinated previous with COVID, if we look at California, vaccinated with previous COVID diagnosis, there was around 1 million people they looked at. There were 3,471 cases. Unvaccinated with previous COVID diagnosis, they looked at around 1.4 million people, and there were about 6,805 cases. Now, these cases are any cases. So that doesn't mean people that were in the ICU. It means any case that was confirmed. It could have been asymptomatic. It's just they found out, because in these places, if you went to the hospital, they tested you for COVID no matter what. So if you broke your arm, you didn't have any symptoms, but you tested positive for COVID, you show up in this test, even though you were asymptomatic, right? What that means is they were proposing a mandate to make your life a living hell for an illness. If you previously had COVID, one second here, let me bring it up. If you had a previous case and were unvaccinated, there were only 6,805 cases over around 1.4 million. That puts your chance of having COVID in this time period, even an asymptomatic case, if you're unvaccinated with natural immunity, at 0.49%. Now, in my estimation, in order to force, I'll end this screen share. I don't think you need it anymore. But in my estimation, wait, how do I do that? Nope. Here we go. The boomer in me. I'll figure it out here. Option. Oh, here we go. End screen. Stop streaming. In my estimation, the things you would need to prove. Now, like you said, you're already against this coercion, which I am 99% of the time. But what you would need to prove is, one, you need to coerce people because the risk to themselves is so bad. The risk is less than 0.5%. Now, second, when you then further look, right, and you look at, okay, well, still, even if you are more protected than the vaccinated, if you have natural immunity, you should still get the vaccine on top of it. And you even said that. You were like,
I do want to point out. Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say.
I want to point out that you're going to see more cases in vaccinated in proportion to unvaccinated than actually exists. Because you're going to see underreporting from unvaccinated people, right? Because people that are unvaccinated are less likely to take a PCR test the moment they feel a fucking chill, right? And so you're going to see a higher portion of cases among the vaccinated that aren't being caught by the unvaccinated. So it is something just to be fair to the data.
But it works the inverse way too. There were probably a significant percentage of people that believed the bullshit. Once you were vaccinated, you couldn't contract the virus. So when they got symptoms of a cold, they never tested because they were like, "Well, this must be a cold." It was,
it's hard. It's hard to tell, but I feel like people that are vaccinated are more likely to be paranoid and get tested.
It could be, right? No study is going to be without any sort of metric. But even if we accept that, right, this number specifically, that you have less than 0.5% chance over the time frame of this to contract, that's irrelevant to comparing to the vaccinated, right? That's just as an unvaccinated person that had a previous case of COVID, that Joe Biden was saying your life should be made hell. You should have to test once a week. Your chance of contracting COVID over this time frame was less than 0.5%.
This is what I want to point you out. What I wanted to point out, because you were talking to Dylan Burns early on, and I remember I watched it, and I was so mad at you, and it wasn't that I was like really mad at you for like being wrong in any capacity. It was just like, I remember I was like, oh my God, there's so much shit he's not talking about, like so much data, and because like I was deep into it. Like I had a treasure trove of like 300 studies at the time, and was like really like knee deep in the shit, and you were like, you knew what you were talking about, but I was like, oh, you could have nailed him on this. He doesn't know about this one, right? One of the things that you got him to admit was, this idea that is probably a key moment in that debate, and it like really stun-locked him, was this idea that like, well, why should people that have recovered from COVID get tested weekly, but people who have not recovered from COVID but are vaccinated shouldn't be tested weekly? Like it makes like you're being a science denier. Right? Like you're forcing people that are less likely to get sick and less likely to spread the virus to get tested because they haven't bent the knee to you. And the thing is that like, he was like, well, maybe if you could prove that, blah, blah, blah. It was like, I wanted to scream so loud. I was like, there's this thing called titers. Okay. You can have a blood draw and you can tell whether or not you have antibodies. And it's like, if you have natural immunity antibodies, there was the fact that titers were never brought up and that you were just going to have to get tested once a week proved that this was all about getting big pharma its money. That's it.
Right. And then here's the other thing, right? People that get the vaccine, sometimes the antibodies don't take either. right? So the argument could be made the same with them. Well, why not test them as well? Why not make them do the titers, the blood draw, right? Like, so it's clearly that's what it showed, and what that moment showed with Dylan was
that would have been authoritarian, but it would have been following the science. They never followed the science.
That it is the sort of big government lefties are always willing to have you make more sacrifices, not themselves, right? Dylan was all for it. He admitted, and it doesn't even matter. This is what a lot of people don't understand in the context of a conversation or a debate. Sometimes things could be wrong within the debate. And by the way, the idea of more data being brought up and stuff, I try to keep things simple for an audience that, like, sometimes getting too much into the data, you lose the bigger point. And it's, as you know, it's like pulling teeth half the time when you're talking to get 1 inch of ground. You have to take 20 minutes because Dylan, and I mentioned this last night, I don't know if you saw it. This is a telltale sign, right? When you ask someone, like, do you think you should get tested? Do I think that I should have to get tested? That's someone that's not giving you an answer of what they truly believe, but they're stalling for time. They're restating the question because in their head they're thinking, "What?" Now it's not always true, but in their head they're thinking, "Well, where's Rob?"
Or the other. Because like, like GSU Gambit is a streamer, right? And sometimes he'll do that, but that's because he's legitimately thinking and is open to having his opinion changed, and so, like, there are sometimes when that occurs. More often than not, you're right. Sometimes people are doing that because they're legitimately thinking and being like, fuck, I might be wrong.
Right, but what he was doing here, and what's happening most of the time, is they're thinking, where are you going?
He's stalling for his chat to give him the answer because he couldn't come up with one himself.
Or just thinking, like, if I say this, what will Rob say? Well, that should be irrelevant. If you ask me, do you think you should get tested? I would say no. And I wouldn't be thinking, I wonder where Fabian's going to try to screw me with this answer. All right, because we're having a conversation. We're being honest with each other. So anyways, what that showed was he was all for, regardless of what, you might be out there right now, not being a science believer and thinking natural immunity is not superior. That's fine. That's your right. But all you need to know in the context of that debate was Dylan conceded that, yes, natural immunity was superior. He conceded that. And he still said, because there was some nominal benefit of even those with natural immunity to get the vaccine on top of it, that they should still be forced to have their life be made hell, to get tested every week until they capitulate and take the vaccine. But as soon as I was like, well, wouldn't that make sense? If it's about stopping the spread, aren't you more likely to stop the spread than those that have previous case of infection? And he acknowledges he is. I'm like, then shouldn't you get tested every week? And it was at that moment when he was asked to make a sacrifice that he was like, never mind. Never mind. If it comes to me sacrificing, then I'm okay. And this is the old Bernie trope, right? Where he said millionaires, senators are immoral until he was a millionaire senator. And then he said billionaire senators are immoral. It's the constant, like, the left-wing authoritarian that's always willing for you. That, Nancy Pelosi was willing for you to make the sacrifice to not go to a hair salon and get your hair done. But she wasn't willing to make that sacrifice. And neither was, what's her name that looks like Beetlejuice there in Chicago? That woman, it was one of the most infuriating comments ever.
No, Maxine Waters, California. Lori Lightfoot.
Lightfoot, right? Like, one of the most infuriating press conferences I'd ever seen. They brought up to her, they were like, look, you banned people going to hair salons, right? And she's like, yeah. And they're like, but you went to a hair salon. And she said, I'm the face of the city. Hygiene matters to me. And, like, that arrogance, there were bigger examples of hypocrisy, but just that arrogance to just right in your face be like, fuck you, I'm better than you, I'll do what I want. Like, it was so blatant. It was like, you're almost impressed. You're like, oh my God. But that's the point I'm trying to, that I was making here with these authoritarians. It's not about what's best. We're looking at this objectively and the sacrifices we all need to make. Now, by the way, apply this to everything. Apply this to fucking Ukraine. Apply this to inflation. Like, you listen to Stephen Colbert say, I'm willing to pay $15 a gallon for gas. Sure, because that's a drop in the hat to him. But my friends that are working 60 hours a week to pay for their family, they can't afford that shit. And what the government's telling them is like, well, you need to make more sacrifices. Why is it always us sacrificing? It's never those assholes, right?
So two things I want to talk about. The one you just brought up, which is energy and inflation and energy, right? Because one of the biggest ways that you can combat inflation is reduce energy costs, right? So how do you reduce energy costs, right? Well, there's four ways to reduce. There's four things that need to be invested in and built if you want to reduce energy costs in order, right? In order from the worst to best, right? Number one is fracking, right? Because fracking reduces our coal consumption, reduces carbon emissions, helps fight the environment, and reduces energy costs. Number three, hydroelectric. Number two, geothermal. And number one, nuclear. Right. Nuclear. Now, honorable mention to things that could be researched that could help us in the future, like better battery technology, algae biofuels, carbon capture, things like that, right? But nevertheless, these are the ways you reduce it. And so what has the Biden administration done? We shut down a pipeline that was going to fail anyways. People give him more shit than he deserves for that because Keystone has been doomed for a long time because of them fighting against it over and over again. But set that aside. Number 2, massive taxes on new oil leases. Okay, well, what happened? Well, they got sued. They lost the court case and said, in Louisiana, saying that it was unconstitutional, the amount of taxes that they were putting on it. So then what he just did is a moratorium, right? He just stopped new oil leases, right? And the oil market is mostly driven by investment. It's not driven by actual supply and demand.
That's the point.
So when you do crazy shit like that, it increases the cost. Right.
And when you campaign on, we're going to shut them down. Right. That's what people do. It's the same with
the strategic oil reserves have not been this low since July of 1984. So he got rid of all of our stockpile, like a third of our fucking stockpiled oil, so that just before the midterms, he could get gas cheap and doesn't give a fuck about that. And of course, they've got to build those oil reserves. So you're looking at a horrible inflation coming Q1 and Q2.
And it's not to get too off track here, but I'll say this real quick. Like when I debated, the argument that I ran almost every debate was something we call business confidence, right? And this is what people don't understand. Most business investment is trying to read tea leaves. Most businesses would be willing to pay more taxes if they knew that the regulations and the taxes they were paying would be consistent for like the next 40 years. They would favor the consistency, even if it meant a short time, because that's what they want. They are very good at making money, and they're spending billions of dollars looking to the future and saying, and then the energy market's no different, right? So what happens is when Biden runs on a promise of, we will shut these people down, right? And then you're right about the pipeline. It's not that pipeline would have provided huge amounts of energy. What it was the first step on day one of showing my promise was real. I'm going to shut down the fossil fuel companies. So then what happens is a bunch of these companies are like, well, we're not going to invest in future projects. We're not going to fight for these. And then of course he's tightening the leases and things like that anyways. But that's what drives me.
Yeah, real quick. There's something in Austrian economic theory, right, which is like kind of the foundation of libertarianism, really, right. Is Austrian economics. What you're describing is something known as low versus high time preference, right? Businessmen that are successful tend to be successful because they have what's known as a low time preference. When time preference is I want it now, or I'm willing to plan on the future, right? And so one of the biggest things that is ruining our society and economy is the more government you have, the more welfare you have, the more society becomes high time preference. They want it now, right? So when you institute Social Security, for example, right? Now you're no longer forced to put money in the bank, save money for your retirement because you have a retirement plan of the government taking care of you. So you become more high time preference. And so that's what you're explaining. It's like they don't even care about having higher taxes if they knew that those taxes were locked in for 40 years. Because they have a low time preference. They're thinking 10 years, 20 years, and they can't do that because the tax rate's going up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. It's also important to understand the Laughlin curve, right, from economics. What a lot of people don't understand is that sometimes when you reduce taxes, you actually increase tax revenue, right? Trump did this. When Trump reduced taxes, tax revenue went up. And the best way to explain this is to understand it's like you have $10, right? And I sell products, and I have a product that's $5 and a product that's $4, right? Which comes to a total of $9, right? Now, let's say taxes are at 20%, right? So you buy the $5 product that you want with your $10, and I charge you $6, right? Right. Now you have $4, and you say, I want the $4 product. And I go, well, sorry, it's $5. It's $4.80 because of taxes, right? But if I reduce taxes by half to 10%, you buy the first product and it's 50 cents, right? So you pay $5.50, you have $4.50 left, and the next one's $4.40. So you get both products that you wanted, and the government gets 90 cents in taxes. So only got 10% reduction in taxes, even though it halved the tax rate, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. People don't understand that sort of investment aspect. That, why would you, if you're in the energy industry and you sincerely believe Joe Biden? Now, the truth is, Biden's full of shit. He's not going to eliminate fossil fuels if it means he'll do so eventually. They're serious about that, but it's not going to be an overnight process. But again, these these businesses are like,
they have no desire. No. Like, don't let him get away with that. Don't be too charitable. You're being too charitable. They have absolutely zero desire to get rid of fossil fuels. If they did, they would deregulate nuclear energy and they would pump a bunch of money into nuclear.
Well,
I wouldn't agree with the pumping the money into it, but that's what they would do. Instead, they give money to solar energy and wind energy, which is the least effective, that costs the most fucking carbon, is terrible energy that causes brownouts and blackouts and is damaging to the environment in multiple ways. Why? Because they're owned by the fucking oil companies that get them elected in the first place. They have no desire to get rid of oil.
Yeah, that's right. But there are a lot of people that were looking at future investment because of the signals that Biden was saying that was going to not invest, and another thing is oil prices are largely speculative. Right. So if you're in those future oil markets and you see that less people are investing in the future, that's going to drive the cost of those up now. Right. Which is going to further enhance inflation, along with the other factors such as the massive spending, the supply chain problems, because you shut down much of the world. All of this was the predictable outcome of lockdowns, of mass spending, of war. Right. That's the predictable outcome.
When the Biden administration officials are bragging about antagonizing Russia and Ukraine, and you've got billions of corrupt money poured into Ukraine, and you've got level 4 and level 5 research labs doing gain of function research, maybe not, air quotes there, in Ukraine, and your son's heavily invested, and Russia, perceives a threat because, you're tacitly promising that you're not going to bring these countries into NATO, and one by one the dominoes are falling around their border, and then war happens at the worst possible moment in a fucking bread basket and gas prices skyrocket. Of course you're going to see additional inflation. Right. So they try and act like that's all the inflation, and I try and act like they have nothing to do with it.
Right. Which, that's what got me. It was like, right, you guys still helped cause this. So even if you're blaming, it's like, oh, it's not that I was drinking that caused the wreck. It was I was shooting heroin in my arm. Great. It's still your fault. Like, right. Like, I don't get the defense here. But, I wanted to go back to these numbers. This is again from that CDC paper. The CDC, this isn't some right wing, like anti-vaxxer. This is a CDC. So we had the percentage
this whole time.
That's right. So when you look at the percentage of your chance, if you were never vaccinated over this period of time and just had not even quote natural immunity, because some of these people perhaps didn't have the antibodies, right? But just looking at everyone with a previous infection, it was a 0.49% chance of contracting COVID, less than 0.5% chance. Now, the people say, but still you should. So that's number one, why you shouldn't have been able to coerce them. The chance of them, the risk of them was so low anyways. Why would you coerce them? Number two is, okay, but would it benefit them on top of it? Well, the same numbers show if you force that population that has less a 0.49% chance of contracting the disease over this period, if you force them to take the vaccine or they choose to take the vaccine, that number slightly dips to 0.35. Is it worth it? Is it worth for that slight 0.1 percentage to force? Of course not. But then it gets even crazier because the truth is we don't really give a shit about contracting COVID. Like one of the things about Omicron, a lot of people were getting COVID that was asymptomatic, right? We were testing all these people and sure, there were false positives, but many of it was like, oh, Omicron's far less lethal than even the official EU CDC said this.
I mean, that's the natural cycle of any virus, right? Is that
that's right?
Unless you have ADE, for the record. But the natural cycle is, what does best when you in a natural population is a virus that is less deadly and more contagious, right? When a new variant pops up that's less deadly and more contagious, it beats out the old variant. And this is what happened with Spanish flu, right? Spanish flu was devastating America. Well, devastating, whatever you want to use, right? But it was destroying. So, and what ended up happening is a new variant came up that people were more likely to get, and it was less deadly. And then they got antibodies to both, because when you get natural immunity, it's not the one change, it's the change, it's the multiple different protein structures of the virus that you gain immunity to.
So early on in
Omicron, knew that was going. Alpha was fucking rough to the elderly.
It was Delta. Yeah.
So was Delta.
Yeah.
But Delta wasn't as bad, but was more contagious.
Right. And so what we saw was early on, the EU CDC came out and they gave, I forget what the fatality rate was of Omicron, but it was actually less than an average influenza season, right? Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, not to get off in the weeds about that, right? The entire argument is, we're not concerned about asymptomatic cases. We're concerned about people having serious cases of COVID. Like, we're not shutting down the world over the common cold. Why? More people get the common cold than get COVID. Right? But the reason we didn't shut it down was we're concerned about people having serious effects, right? So if 10,000 people with previous COVID infection re-get COVID and it's asymptomatic, who gives a shit, right? I
want to point out two things because we both go into rants, but two things I want to talk about, right? And you brought up this one. I think it's really important. There's this cycle. Government causes a problem, and then government sells you the solution. And right. One of the things that we've been talking about, right, was the initial argumentation before Yale was contracted to figure out the propaganda for the government, and Yale did a clinical trial, so that they could propagandize people. Before all of that, right, 15 days to slow the spread was the argument, right? 15 days, we got to slow the spread because of the stress on the hospital system. But it's really important to recognize, well, why was the hospital system stressed? And it's certificate of need boards. This is the huge thing that we have to get rid of in this country. You know what a certificate of need board is?
Vaguely.
Okay, so a con board. Right?
I know through my work I've dealt with it somewhat, but right. Go ahead.
Let's say I own a private hospital. In about half the states in this country, it's illegal for me to build an addition to the hospital. Unless I go through an extremely expensive and bureaucratic process where I bring in members of the community. I bring in doctors. I have like a year of like letting them know ahead of time. They come in and they can voice their concerns about why it's wrong for me to build a new wing of the hospital. I have to jump through red tape over red tape over red tape in order to expand a hospital, right? Now, hospitals are designed to be at about 80% capacity, because you don't want a bunch of empty beds. But there are a ton of hospitals in this country that operate at 90% because it's difficult for them to be able to expand because the government has made it exceedingly expensive and costly and time sink in order to be able to expand the hospital. So the government comes in and causes this problem that stresses the healthcare industry. And then a virus comes in that like stresses the healthcare industry to capacity. And they go, oh, well, this is why we need to lock you down. And it's like, no, you caused this fucking problem. Like, if we didn't have con boards, like, we would have a lot more hospitals that were able to take overflow and were not at capacity. And it never would have been an issue in any of the hospitals. Yes, some hospitals might have been stressed when it when there was a bit of a bomb in an area, right? But they would have had plenty of overflow to another hospital. And so it was the government that caused this fucking problem to begin with.
And the other thing is that it's just not true anyways. Hospitalization is actually lower than pre-COVID levels and has been almost the entire time. Right?
Yeah, there are killed all the old people, man.
Well, that's part of it. But this is the narrative. Like, we'll get to it, right? Because they'll say, right, think of it this way. The only feasible argument that they could make to force you to take this medication or to make your life hell is because your poor decision is negatively affecting other people. So it's a pandemic of right? Because we wouldn't, and I did this in my debate with Dylan Burns. We would look at me and we'd say, Rob, your blood pressure is high. Therefore, you have to take this blood pressure medication. We're going to force you, or you have to be tested once a day for your blood pressure. And if it's over a certain number, you can't go to work. We would say, no, the government, most people would say, I know what you would say anyways, but most people would say the government doesn't have the right to do that. If you want to make bad choices for yourself, so be it, as long as they're not. So it always cruxed on people not taking the vaccine were harming those that were taking the vaccine. And when you prove that that's bullshit, that actually those with natural immunity were more protected and less spreading than those that were vaccinated, right? Once you prove that, right, then they move on to the next talking point, which is, well, they're overwhelming the hospitals. No, they're not. They're not overwhelming the hospitals. That's bullshit too, right? And so, and again, what's the argument for, and you heard people become monsters. They would say, well, if you didn't take the vaccine and you're hospitalized, you should have to give up that bet. I wanted to debate Destiny on this, right? Because it's like, what figure, at what percent do you say no longer will we treat people that are unvaccinated? 80% utilization? Because that's basically the average in the United States for years before this. Right? So now all of a sudden people who know nothing about it are pointing to it going, this specific hospital in Pittsburgh, PA is at 82% utilization. Therefore, we should stop treating people that are unvaccinated. And it's like, yeah, the average year before COVID was 80% utilization. Right? Or 84% utilization, because a lot of people, not only were people dying, but people were not going to the hospital for other reasons because they were so fearful of COVID. So hospitalization, there were, I could show you articles. My local hospital
thing
here.
Pharmaceutical companies are putting out called post-pandemic hypochondria.
Right. People aren't getting other vaccines.
Because so many people know, like that they think they're sick all the time because the media basically, indoctrinated them into the most absurd levels of fear, right? That now every time they have a sniffle, like hypochondria is through the roof because of all of the fear mongering that occurred during the pandemic.
I'll tell you a story, and I've asked my brother, and he's okay for me to share this story. A local hospital here that's the closest one to me, during the height of the pandemic in 2020, were forced to lay off like 50 nurses. And it's a small hospital, so that was a very significant amount, right? And the reason was they were going bankrupt because the hospitals were barren. People that show up for elective things or preventative health and things like that were no longer going because there was this fear that any minute the hospital could be overwhelmed in COVID. When these nurses were being laid off, I shit you not, this hospital up to that point in like August of 2020 had one case of COVID. One. The hospital is barren for months because people are freaked out that hospitals are about to be overwhelmed. So much so that in the height of a pandemic, this hospital and many others in Pennsylvania were literally laying off healthcare professionals because the hospitals were so barren. Now, my brother had
to point out, when people say elective surgery, what that people think of it as like cosmetic surgery, right? And what elective actually means is you're not going to die today if you don't get this surgery today. Right. And so a lot of these surgeries are necessary and it's the same thing you'll hear in snuck in, right? When people debate socialized medicine versus free market capitalism in healthcare, right? Is they'll say, oh, well, the waiting list in Canada is, averages 66 days for elective surgeries, right? And in America, it's like 30 days, right? So like, these are elective surgeries. Well, it's like, no, what we're talking about is like a kidney transplant is an elective surgery.
Right. That's right. And so the example I could give is this, and I'll use my brother twice for examples. The first example is this. My brother is in his mid-20s. He has chronic seizures, terrible, terrible seizures. He was scheduled for brain surgery that they thought they exhausted all other options, medications to end these seizures. They were so bad that he would routinely have them and shatter his collarbone because he would seize so terribly and fall so terribly. So his procedure had to be put off. Because these hospitals that had no one going to them were like, sorry, we can't do it because we're afraid that we'll be overwhelmed at any moment now. Then he had a terrible seizure. And my mom, thankfully, was driving him to this same hospital, right? And he always had these seizures in spurts. He would have one and then be very confused for 30 minutes, then have another. And so my mom would go with him into the hospital. My mom walks into the hospital with him. The hospital says, you can't be here. Only patients can be here. Again, it is a barren hospital, but we're worried about COVID, so you can't be here. So my brother goes in.
Like, normally, if 70 people randomly come through the front door with COVID, I'll leave. Like, let me go be with my son,
Right. So no one's there, right? The parking lot's empty. My mom's waiting in the parking lot. She thinks she's going to spend the night in the car because they're going to keep him overnight. About an hour later, he comes basically staggering out. And my mom's like, what are they doing? They're like, they said I have to go home. Because, again, they were so worried about COVID that they sent this guy who just had this terrible seizure. They were like, okay, go home. So it's 20 minutes from that hospital to my mom's house. He has a horrible seizure on the way home. My mom, he's seizing with the seatbelt on. So my mom pulls off to the side of the road, opens the car door, gets the seatbelt off, and he flings out of the car, shatters his collarbone again. All because this fucking idea that, we're going to be overwhelmed any minute. And it never happened. This hospital was never overwhelmed, but that's the kind of bullshit that you had to put up with. And so the people that are claiming amnesty and shit, fuck you, right? You're the pieces of shit that developed this authoritarian mentality that led to real world harm. That's one story. There are millions of stories of how the lockdowns, the mandates and stuff.
So there's one more thing that I wanted to talk about, and it's something that I think a lot of people missed. And well, they didn't miss the story, but they didn't quite get the story right. And I think it does play into this, which is, this kind of idea that there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government solution, right? Or a temporary government program, right? And that is recently, not, a couple months back, we saw that the vaccine was added to the ACIP, right? The Advisory Committee Immunity Practices, I think is what it is, ACIP, which is basically the vaccine schedule for kids, right? And so many conservative pundits, and I saw like Tucker Carlson talk about it, they all got the fucking story wrong. And it infuriates me now because they don't understand what actually happened. So many people are like, they're trying to mandate that your kids get the vaccine if they want to go to school. It's like, that is not what happened. And it infuriates me that so many people miss this. What they miss is that if you add a vaccination to the ACIP, right? What this does is this automatically puts it on the VICP, Vaccine Injury
so they can't never
Compensation Program. Right. And so the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program is what grants legal immunity to these companies to basically, they pay a small portion of money, taxes pay a small portion of money, and then individuals that are injured by vaccines, you don't go to court. You can't sue these people. What you do is instead you basically sue the government, and the government has representatives that are there to represent the interests of the pharmaceutical companies. And it's the evidence that's necessary under the VICP is like less than a court of law, right? So you kind of have like two things, beyond reasonable doubt for criminal cases, and for civil suits, it's, a balance of probabilities, right? And so it's a balance of probabilities, but the standards aren't as high. This is why we get bullshit anti-vax shit being like, fucking MMR caused my kid to have autism. It's like, yeah, and the court case proves it. And it's like, that's the VICP. It's easier to win a case on the VICP. Nevertheless, we just saw the appropriations bill come through, and they increased a 13% increase to the VICP, and they added something that was never added before. And it was this line: and any additional funds that are necessary.
Right.
They know that
It's
your
coming.
tax dollars are going to be spent to protect the pharmaceutical companies that are immune to prosecution for what we know is going to be tons of vaccine injuries. We know that.
And it's
they've
for
been
a
granted immunity,
population.
and that's what really happened. And that's the thing, is that this fear has allowed people to be completely subjective in the way that they look at these things and not recognize what's happening. What's happening is it's like George Carlin said, it's a big club and you ain't fucking in it.
Right. And it's, the policies of the left. And again, it's like you said earlier, they create the problem and then say, well, you have to come to us for the solution. Right. And so like, you say what you want. As small government people, right, it is undoubtable that the last 2 years, since, the last 8-9 months of Trump and then going into the Biden administration, specifically regarding COVID, has seen one of the largest increases in government authority, both in the revenue they're getting, the money they're printing, the authority that they've had, literally telling people things like, you can't go to church, right? You can't go to your daughter's wedding. Like, that's how authoritarian they became. That big government program has, beyond a shadow of a doubt, increased wealth disparity in this country, from the poor and working class siphoning to the wealthiest people, in one of the quickest, most staggering ways we've ever seen. And their solution
larger
is
than in all of American history.
Right, and their solution is, let's do more of it. And that'll fix it. If we just do more. Let's force more lockdowns. Let's force more mandates. Let's force more vaccines. Let's force more boosters. Let's force more spending, right? That's their argument. They cause the problem and then go, oh, geez, it's the same shit in Ukraine, right? Like, not to get too in the weeds, right? But I'm debating people 2-3 years ago, like, are you cool with this in Syria? The intentional provoking of Putin, right? Because we're bombing Syria and Assad, and that's one of the, you cool with this? And they're like, oh, he'll never do shit. And then when he does, they're like, oh, see, we need to be over there. It's like, yeah,
we need $100 billion.
That's not to forgive Putin. I'm not saying Putin's a good guy, but I'm just saying this is what they constantly do. Ron Paul called this out in 2008, right? When he was running, he was like, I'm not saying don't blame the terrorists that hijacked and attacked on 9/11, but if you stick your foot in a pit of vipers, Don't be surprised when you get bit. We keep meddling in these affairs and we keep creating more terrorists and we keep financing them. And then when the blowback happens, the very people that did all of it are like, oh, shucks. Well, you got to listen to us now. You know, I wanted to get this out real quick, right? I was talking about the severity of COVID, right? So, those cases that matter. Suffice it to say, I'm not going to be long-winded about this, which is very difficult for me. But when you look at the numbers, those same numbers that we were looking at, around 1 million people that were vaccinated with previous COVID, and those that were unvaccinated with previous, there was 1.4 million. You could check the numbers out for yourself if you want. But if you look at it, out of 1.3 million people that had a previous case of COVID and weren't vaccinated, over this time frame, you know how many people had to be hospitalized with COVID? 378. 378 out of 1.4 million. That is staggeringly low. But here's the kicker. People say, but still, force them to take the vaccine on top of it. You want to hear the kicker? Over the course of this study, those that were unvaccinated with natural immunity had a 0.0276 chance of being hospitalized with COVID. And if those people then decide to get vaccinated, then they had a 0.0282% chance of being hospitalized. Although the difference is so small, it's statistically insignificant. You read that right. The chances of being hospitalized with COVID over the course of this study slightly increased when you force those people to get vaccinated. Now, I will grant that anyone who knows how stats work would say, yeah, but it's so small, it's statistically insignificant. Right. These numbers are all so small, it's statistically insignificant. And you're suggesting making these people's lives hell. Right? So the argument that people tried to default to once it was proven, which is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, that natural immunity is superior to vaccinated immunity. And what they always fall back to is, yeah, but make them do both. Both is better. Bullshit. They're at almost no risk, and both is so marginally beneficial to them. And that's before we even get into a discussion of side effects. Right? We aren't even talking about myocarditis. We're not talking about what I used. I don't even use myocarditis, right? What I used was anaphylaxis. So according to the studies I was looking at, they looked at this study that, again, I used pro-vaccine studies. People whose conclusions were, you should get out and take the vaccine. This is what they said. Allergic reaction or anaphylaxis was reported in 26 out of 8,680 participants after one dose and 27 after 2 doses. So to sum it up, according to the latest CDC paper, those with natural immunity had about a 0.0276 chance of being hospitalized with COVID. But in this other paper, if you get the vaccine, you have a 0.3% chance of having an anaphylactic reaction. That means the risk is 10 times worse that you'll have an allergic reaction to the vaccine than you would have ever been hospitalized with COVID. That's fucking monstrous. That we're forcing. Now, is it true that none of these studies are completely comprehensive? Of course.
Yeah. I mean, like, you're dealing with numbers that are so small that, like, yeah, I mean, like, I don't want to play the lefty fucking portion here because I've always been against these mandates, but, like, I do try to be scientific as much as I can about it. And I think the real problem is the authoritarianism is a kind of like one size fits all glove, right? And so a great person that I think everyone should look at on YouTube is Vinay Prasad. Vinay Prasad has over 10,000 citations as a oncology researcher. He is also and over 8,000 in the last 5 years. On top of that, he is a epidemiology associate professor. Great guy to just look at the actual science of it. And so the real question here is like, when you group all of the demographics together and then you have numbers that are so statistically insignificant that it kind of doesn't matter, like, you're right. And because the response is to a one size fits all kind of version of authoritarianism. But the question really should be, which it isn't, this should be a risk assessment, right? And so if you want to do an appropriate risk assessment, then you got to look at the data aggregated based off of demographics, right? And so the question is, what is the difference between a 12-year-old and or a 22-year-old male versus what is the difference between a 65-year-old woman with diabetes? What is the risk for a pregnant woman or a breastfeeding woman? We don't fucking know because clinical trials won't be done until 2023 and 2024 for pregnant women, right? So if you're pregnant, if you're a young woman, reasonably healthy, pregnant, or you plan to get pregnant, or you're breastfeeding, the idea that you get this vaccine is fucking retarded, right? If you're a young man and you're healthy and you're getting out there, and the idea that you get this vaccine, the risk assessment, it's fucking retarded, right? But then the other question is, well, let's look at the data aggregated by boosters, right? It may be that if you're a middle-aged man, that it is better for you to get the vaccine in one booster. But that if you've never gotten COVID, which at this point, I'm surprised I just now caught COVID. I don't know how the fuck I didn't catch it in the beginning, but I got it, right? But you know what I mean?
December 2020, my wife was 9 months pregnant. My son was due January 6th, and we both tested positive for COVID. For her, it was nothing. For me, I had a fever of I streamed all 7 days. I got 2 community strikes 2 years later for the videos I did that was literally just, this is me with COVID in December 2020. Apparently that was COVID misinformation, explaining what my symptoms were. 2 years later, after I debated some trans people, I got mass reported on YouTube and got 2 community strike videos I did 2 years previous talking about me having COVID. But that gets to my point, right? Like, I don't disagree. And that's what I've said. Listen, I'm sure you agree with this. If you're listening to me or Fabian for medical advice, you're fucking up. Don't, right? Particularly me. Look at me. Do I look like a guy who should be giving medical advice? Of course not, right? You should find a healthcare professional that you trust, give your exact risk assessment, and come to a decision that works best for you. I am not against the vaccine. I am against the mandate. I will not pick on you. If you take the vaccine and it ends up being a poor decision, I'm not going to say, haha, you deserved it. I'll say that's horrible. I feel terrible. If you don't take the vaccine and you end up getting sick, I'm not going to make fun of you. It's a difficult decision. People are rightfully scared because there's so much fear mongering being put in. I get it. Make the decision that's best for you. I'm against the government forcing you to do this shit. The mandates, the lockdowns, that's what I'm against. It should be up to you to make these decisions for yourself. You're right about that it should be a matter of risk assessment, but there's 2 problems, right? One, the data isn't being aggregated in a significant way where people or even medical professionals like at the local level, like the doctor that would be giving you your vaccine, where are they going to see this data? And the reason that it's difficult for them to see the data is because the fucking government is actively censoring people that don't toe the party line anyways. So not only if you do, so
well,
your incentive.
Let's be honest.
Well, you know what I mean. But yes, absolutely. So your incentive to do a study like this, first off, your ability to do a large scale study that would aggregate based on these things is going to be difficult anyways. Second, your incentive to do it's going to be low because you'd be ostracized even in your field, as many doctors were. But thirdly, then you risk doctors were seriously risking losing their medical license and being censored on their social media platforms for doing this. So all of this means that your ability to actually see this data was very minimized. But when you do look at the data that's available, even that data that's not aggregated shows that they're wrong, shows that in these particular risk assessment, I'm just taking one group, people that had a previous COVID infection. There are all sorts of other groups. Like, what is the risk assessment for a 5-year-old with no illnesses? Well, it turns out that when you aggregate the data, as you already did with total deaths, that more people in that age group are dying from falling downstairs or dying from misuse of over-the-counter medication than are dying of COVID. In fact, at least in 2020 and 2021, I believe both those years, someone you should follow is a friend of mine, Phil Kerpen. He's at Phil Kerpen on Twitter. He's amazing. Just a really brilliant mind. And he does a great job of Kerpen. Kerpen. And I've had him on my show. He's a great guy. He was in the debate community. I knew him from there. He's a genius level intellect, just a brilliant guy. And one of the things he does is just show data. That's it. He'll just show the data, right? And he was constantly showing throughout 2020 and 2021, respiratory illness-wise was one of the safest respiratory illness seasons for people under the age of 12 that we've seen in recorded history. And yet,
because people were quarantined, you know what I mean? Like they weren't getting the flu. You know what
nonetheless,
I mean? To be fair.
But the idea that But even with COVID, with the ability to contract COVID, like there were all sorts of kids were more likely to get COVID that were locked down from schools than were going to schools. I mean, the data is amazing. It's backwards to what you would think, but the data's there, right? And so the problem is the impetus was never on people like me and you that were against the government coercion to prove the case. The impetus is on the people that want to prove the case. And you're right. They never aggregated it. They relied on government censorship and cultural censorship and saying things like, what do you want
one of the
grandma
biggest
to die?
things they did that they had zero data on. They had no data to justify in any way, shape, or form mask mandates, basically in general, but also for children in schools, right? There was no data that was just fear. And what we saw from the America First was what they were citing at the CDC was polling data. When they were talking,
it was incredible.
They were citing polling data.
Yep.
The idea that you cite polling data to make like government top-down mandates is just proves that it's political, that it has absolutely nothing to do with this. I would suggest anyone that really wants to look into this stuff to understand how science works, and again, not someone I would necessarily fully support, but Curtis Yarvin talking about the cathedral and talking about how science works. There's a great interview that he did with Tucker Carlson, where he talks about the way the elite and the academics kind of like work in this new niche-driven science-based kind of government field. And the way that like specialization of knowledge has kind of lended itself to this trust the science kind of thing is very, very interesting, right? Because government 100 years ago, you didn't have these highly advanced specific fields. And so because of that, no one knows what the fuck they're talking about, except for the people that really like understand that highly specific field. And so what ends up happening is, there's this push-pull kind of situation where if you support government narratives and you support, the state and what it is that the state wants, well, then you rise because the money is there, the prestige is there, etc. And if you don't, you fall to the wayside. And so the people that we're getting all of our advice from are the people that are incentivized to specifically support state authoritarian control. It's not like an evil cabal of like Jews somewhere pulling strings. It's just the way that a system is set up when you give authority and power to the government.
And what I like to do, because it's difficult, and I'm not sitting here and saying that I'm some brilliant mind that understands these. I don't, right? That's one of the things that I try to stay in my lane, is that I'm a layman when it comes to this. I think that maybe I have a reasonable amount of intelligence compared to other laymen, but other than that, there's nothing spectacular about me, right? And so oftentimes I think what's important to do, because these things do seem overly complicated, they are complicated. Find the easiest issue to prove your point. That's why I focused on people with prior infection. That data was evident from the get-go. It was evident, right? So you might say, your end result might be like, okay, Rob, you're right about that, so we should mandate all of those without previous infection. But it's like, but you already see that the people that are making these policies aren't serious. This was never about taking a look, and saying, let's be as focused as possible, viewing the science, aggregating as much as possible to separate specific groups to come up with. It was never about that. It was always about authoritarian control, right? The other issue that is the best issue to look at is exactly what you talked about with children. It's sort of an appeal to authority that I don't like to make, but you have to understand this, right? This appeal to authority, because one of the things we see, it's the impetus is on the people wanting to coerce you. The government's wanting to coerce you to prove their point, right? And oftentimes what they'll do in all sorts of things, right? When it comes to the medical industry or climate change, is say, look at what all of these international countries are doing. Look at what these international bodies, so we can't be the outlier. When you see it go the opposite way, though,
Japan.
It is astounding.
God, I wish we would have followed it like Japan did. Japan did great.
Right. Well, but to me, every major Western country knew by mid-2021 that it was a horrible mistake to lock down children. Everyone knew. All the data. There wasn't even an outlier study that I could find that said that locking down, everyone, even countries that had mandates, even countries that had lockdowns and other ways were like, yeah, locking down children's a mistake. That's a mistake. All of the data shows that not only does it not help, not only is COVID not that serious for them, not only does this not prevent the transmission of COVID for them, but it's harming them in immense ways, in other ways. The CDC, I forget what her name was, but the woman that was running the CDC basically came out and said, okay, we're going to lift school lockdowns. And now we know that Randy Weirgarten, at one of the largest teachers unions, contacted the Biden administration, contacted the CDC, and within 2 days, the CDC, against all available scientific evidence, decided to reinstate lockdowns for children. Well, something that will have monstrous effects for these children for years to come. And the idea that this was done with, they didn't even pretend, and it's largely like the mask as well, but on this particular issue, all of us can understand. You could explain to your neighbor that's not looking into this, hey man, they locked your kid down from school for a year. You could see the negative effects of that, right? Of course, they could see it. And it's like, now show me the evidence they suggested that said that that was necessary. They can't. There never was evidence. All of the evidence went the other way. And once you understand that and could show someone, an average person, that, then be like, well, do you think that that was different when they were talking about, vax mandates to buy groceries in New York? Do you think it was different when they were talking about the need to lock down the economy, in Pennsylvania? Of course not. It was never about the science. They were just bullshitting you for authoritarianism.
So, yeah, Casimir points out something good. With our schools, maybe it was a hidden blessing. I do think it has woken a lot of parents up
Well,
to
yes,
what's
that's
going
true.
on in schools, right? CASEL, social emotional learning being in
Yep.
33% of all elementary schools, but
Yep.
not getting into that right now. You just watched a clip from our Twitch channel, Fabian Liberty. If you like content like this, please like and subscribe here on YouTube, or go ahead and give us a follow on twitch.tv/Fabian Liberty.